Chris, I, like you, was trained in science, and I've had this almost obsession with knowing about the universe and really trying to understand, can religion, theology make any contribution? So one of the things I ask myself is, what can religion learn from science? And of course, there's a lot of factual things about the universe, about evolution. But in terms of ways of thinking, can religion learn anything from science?
Oh, I think religion can learn an enormous amount from science, in the sense that, I came in originally as somebody with a scientific training in astrophysics. And so there's a particular sort of critical thinking which is involved in the sciences, which can be very helpful, I think, to the theologian. And I'm always interested that the theologians who I immediately respond to are often people with a scientific background, because they're thinking in the same sort of critical way. That's not to say that other theologians don't think critically, but with a slightly different background, inevitably I don't feel as at home, if you like, with them as I do with people with that scientific background.
So what does that mean in terms of literally how you approach your theology in terms of applying critical analysis?
Partly it means sitting back from the problem and just saying, how many different ways can I even look at this problem? That's certainly one of the elements that's there. The second thing is actually asking, okay, how can I test any hypotheses that I come up with? That doesn't mean that in theology you can do exactly the same sort of tests as you can in physics, for example. But nevertheless, there is a quite strong sense, I think, that that sort of thinking about hypotheses, asking what questions you can ask about hypotheses, testing those hypotheses in the way that's appropriate to theology, which is different.
Certainly not by experimentation and
certainly not by
corroboration
experimentation.
and
But I think...
But a way of thinking more than anything.
I mean, if you think about all those sort of academic subjects which have some sort of claim to be rational, it's very interesting if you look at the social sciences, for example. What you have there, again, people in the social sciences say, yes, this is a science, but again, they can't test the hypothesis in the way that a physicist can. What they can do is say, okay, let's be careful when we look at, the way, the various forms of thought, the hypotheses, the frameworks that we have. How do we actually think through, say, how the social sciences work? And certainly some theologians have claimed that, in a sense, the social sciences act as a bridge between the hard sciences, if you like, and theology.
What is an example from theology in which critical analysis learned from the sciences can be useful?
I think one of the things, for example, that's been happening for 200 years is to actually ask significant historical questions. It's something that theology really wasn't doing much before the early 19th century. Now, obviously, again, that's not exactly like the sciences, but nevertheless, in cosmology, for example, I'm thinking about the history of the universe. In theology, what we've been doing for the last 200 years is thinking about the historical background out of which, certain events arose, out of which certain types of thinking arose. So that we no longer, for example, when we talk about the Nicene Creed, say, this is simple truth, in the sense that, it has nothing to do with the particular culture out of which it came. We actually have to ask, when that creed was formulated in the early 4th century, why were people using that sort of language? What did the language mean to them then? And I think very often now we tend to use this sort of historical language in all the religious faiths, especially the Christian faith, and sometimes just don't ask the important historical questions. What questions were they asking at that time? Why did they think that this was a good answer rather than that was a good answer? What did those words actually mean to those people at that time? Because they may be saying something which is different to the way we would use that term now.
So how important is it to really understand language as we're dealing with theology? Because most people think that the standard words in theology have gone back to the New Testament or the Old Testament or other scriptures in different religious traditions. So how critical is it to do a critical analysis of language?
I think it's absolutely central. In one of my books, when I was talking about Revelation, I actually focused not so much on historical revelation, though I tried to look into that, but I also tried to look partly at the way that language is used. How does God reveal himself to us in the sense that, if, for example, somebody claims prophetic inspiration, what does that mean? Is God talking directly to that person as, for instance, Muslims tend to think is true of the Quranic revelation? Or is it something much, much more subtle? And here I think, again, this is an example of where the sciences can be very, very important to us, because if we ask how scientific language works, it doesn't work in the way that most people think. We tend to assume that when we, let's say, talk about an electron, we're talking about something which is a particle with a certain charge and all the rest of it. If we actually ask how has that language arisen and what's going on there, you've got a real problem which philosophers of science have tried to get at, of actually saying, how do we relate the language we use to the things that we're trying to refer to? Now, the standard problem there has been that, in fact, that science has changed over the years. So inevitably, philosophers of science have tried to work through how we can understand those changes in the context of a rational community. Now, one of the things that they've come up with is this lovely phrase, critical realism. In other words, they've said, look, scientific language is realistic. It genuinely refers to the world, which is out there, so to speak. But we have to be critical in the sense that we have to acknowledge that things will change as time goes on. New scientific theories come along, new scientific understandings of old terms come along. Now, at one level, that sounds fine, but at another level, I suspect that many people in the science religion world in particular have had a rather too simplistic understanding of critical realism. I've been very influenced by two philosophers of science, Mary Hesse and Ron Harry, who have both said, yes, we can talk about realism, but that realism refers to the way the world is structured. We really are, in the sciences, getting towards the way the world is structured. But what the world is made up of, the ontology of the world, if you like, is something that actually science can't easily get to. And in fact, we occasionally do find that there are big changes in the way the ontology of the world is actually described in the sciences.
How then can you apply that to theology?
Well, my own feeling is that if we want to use critical realism of theology, and I think I do, then we have to say that, look, when we use words like God even, we're bringing a whole lot of baggage to that, which isn't necessarily part of what we really want to say, or at least what is central to what we really want to say. It's one of the problems, I think, of the Judeo-Christian tradition, for example. It's also one of its strengths, but that it has a real historical rooting in the scriptures of the Old Testament and the New Testament. But if we look at the God of the Old Testament, first of all, we have a very anthropomorphic picture. Basically, it's a sort of supersized version of ourselves, sometimes a supersized version of ourselves who is not ethically really up to scratch. Some of the bits of the Old Testament, if you look at them carefully, you think, what on earth is this about? And one of the things that was happening through the Old Testament period, in fact, was that ancient picture of God as somebody who acted in a rather sort of, despotic, capricious sort of way, was transformed in an ethical way, so that by the time you get certainly some of the later prophets and this sort of thing, you actually have a very different picture of God. But we can still bring that sort of picture of God, almost the white, the chap with the white beard sitting on the cloud. We can bring that to our picture of God, and almost unconsciously, so that one of the examples that I often give is that when we talk about divine action, for example, how does God act in the world? There is still an assumption at the back of a lot of people's minds that we still have, the white-bearded chap on the white cloud who is occasionally just interfering with the world. And that comes to some extent from that scriptural picture. So the really critical element is, how do we deal with things which were perhaps once appropriate to the human perception of God, but are no longer appropriate? Simple example, when you're a child, you do have a very simplistic picture of God. As you grow up, you throw away some of those pictures that you had when you were small. In a sense, they're idols. They're something that now stand between you and God, or you're using instead of God. I think some of the types of language we use of God can sometimes be idolatrous in that sort of way.